It started like every other day in the institution. A dismal haze of fluorescent lights and the sterile scent of cleaning chemicals. The metal-framed bed beneath me was rigid and unyielding, its thin mattress a poor ally in my quest for sleep. Still, it was better than the alternative, the suffocating silence that came with being awake in a place like this. Every sound, from the faint hum of the ventilation system to the distant echoes of another patient's cries, took on a menacing quality in the dead of night. I didn't think much of it when they assigned me a roommate. "This is John," the orderly said, motioning to the wiry man behind him. John stepped into the room cautiously, his thin lips curling into what might have been a smile or a sneer. It was hard to tell. His hands clutched a single duffel bag, and his eyes darted around the room as though it were some kind of elaborate trap. "Hi, I'm Max," I said, extending a hand. He stared at it for an uncomfortable moment before nodding and dropping his bag onto the empty bed.
"No hands, Jack."
The first thing he told me as soon as the orderly left was that he wasn't supposed to be here. "They made a mistake," he said in a low, hurried voice, as though someone might be eavesdropping just beyond the door. "I'm not crazy, you know? This whole thing, it's a misunderstanding." I didn't argue. It was easier that way. A lot of the people here said things like that. Denial, they called it during group therapy. John didn't talk much after that, but he had a way of existing in my peripheral vision that made it impossible to relax. He sat cross-legged on his bed most of the time, his head tilted just enough to give the impression he was watching me. Whenever I turned to look at him, his eyes would dart away, pretending to focus on the wall or the peeling edge of the nightstand. At first, I thought it was paranoia. I told myself I was just being ridiculous. After all, wasn't I here because of my own overactive imagination? Hallucinations, delusions, nightmares that bled into the waking world. I knew the drill. I'd been here long enough to recognize the signs. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about John. He didn't join the others in the cafeteria during meals, preferring instead to stay in our room, muttering to himself. The nurses didn't seem to care. They'd drop off his tray and leave him to it. One night, I watched him shove his dinner under the bed and walk away as if he'd eaten it. When I asked him why, he just smiled. "Not hungry," he said, his voice as dry as the air in the room. It wasn't long before I started locking the bathroom door whenever I showered, a habit I hadn't bothered with since arriving here. I told myself it was just because I valued my privacy, but deep down I knew better. I was scared of him, of John. But it wasn't until that night, the night everything changed, that I truly understood why. The air in the room was suffocatingly still that night. The faint flicker of moonlight through the barred window cast long, jagged shadows across the walls. I remember staring at the ceiling, trying to lull myself into the oblivion of sleep. But something felt off. The kind of off that tightens your chest and makes your skin prickle with an unseen charge. I rolled over, my gaze drifting toward John's bed. At first, I thought he was still lying there, motionless as usual. But then I realized the shape under his blanket wasn't moving. It was too still, too flat. My pulse quickened. He wasn't in his bed. I sat up slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The room seemed darker than it should have been, the corners swallowed in an unnatural gloom. That's when I saw him. John was standing by my bed, close enough that I could see the gleam of his teeth in the faint light. He was smiling. "John!" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. His head tilted slightly, the grin widening as he brought something into view. A long, gleaming knife clutched in his hand. My breath hitched as the blade caught the light, reflecting an eerie glint that danced across the walls. My stomach churned. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I scooted back against the wall, my body pressed tight against the cold plaster. His smile never faltered. "Shoo!" he whispered, holding a finger to his lips. "I just wanted to see you." I froze, my mind scrambling for an explanation, an escape, anything that could pull me out of this waking nightmare. The world seemed to narrow down to the sharp edge of that blade and the maddening calm in his eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you," he continued, his voice soft, almost soothing. "Not unless you make me." I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could make a sound, he pressed the knife's cold edge lightly against my throat. "No," he said, almost regretfully. "Don't ruin this, Max." My entire body trembled as I stared into his face. His expression was serene, almost peaceful, as though he were savoring this moment. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The weight of the knife against my skin was like a vice, holding me in place. "I'm not crazy, you know," he said again, his tone conversational, as if we were chatting over coffee. "But they wouldn't listen. They just locked me in here, said I was dangerous." His eyes twitched slightly, the smile faltering for the briefest of moments. "I'm not dangerous, Max. You believe me, don't you?" I nodded. It was the only thing I could do. My mind was screaming for help, but my body refused to betray me, paralyzed by the thin line between survival and catastrophe. "Good," he said, stepping back abruptly. The pressure of the knife disappeared, and I exhaled shakily, realizing I'd been holding my breath. John retreated to his bed and lay down as if nothing had happened, pulling the blanket over himself like a child tucking in for the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't dare. When the pale light of dawn finally seeped through the window, I worked up the courage to glance over at his bed. It was empty again, but this time it wasn't just John who was gone. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets crisp and untouched. His duffel bag, his shoes, the knife. Everything was gone, as though he'd never been there at all. When I told the nurse during morning rounds, she gave me a puzzled look. "Max," she said slowly, "you've always had this room to yourself." The nurse's words echoed in my head like a tolling bell. "You've always had this room to yourself." I stared at her, searching her face for any hint that she might be lying, or at least playing some cruel joke. But her expression was a mixture of confusion and concern. Her clipboard held awkwardly against her chest. "That's not possible," I said, my voice thin and cracking. "He was here last night. John, my roommate. You assigned him to me 2 weeks ago." She shook her head slowly, her brows furrowing in sympathy. "Max, I've been doing rounds in this wing every day. You haven't had a roommate since you were transferred here." I tried to argue, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. I described John in vivid detail. His wiry frame, his darting eyes, the way he muttered to himself at night. I even told her about the knife. At that, her expression changed. The sympathy melted into something colder. She pressed a button on her walkie-talkie. "Dr. Patel, could you come to room 217? We've got a situation." "I'm not crazy," I stammered, a sharp edge of desperation in my voice. "I know he was here. He threatened me. He held a knife to my throat." The nurse stepped back cautiously, as if I might lunge at her. "It's okay, Max. Let's just calm down, all right? Dr. Patel will sort this out." I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed, my hands trembling. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating every corner of the room. The bed opposite mine was bare. No sheets, no duffel bag, no sign that anyone had ever occupied it. I gripped the sides of my head, trying to steady the spinning in my skull. Am I losing it? Minutes later, Dr. Patel arrived, his white coat fluttering as he stepped into the room. He had the kind of warm, practiced smile that doctors in places like this use to reassure their patients. He closed the door behind him and took a seat in the chair by the window. "Nurse Tellman says you're upset," he began, his voice calm and measured. "Why don't you tell me what's going on?" I repeated everything I'd said to the nurse, every detail I could remember. The way John smiled with too many teeth. The feel of the knife's cold blade against my throat. The impossibility of him simply vanishing. Dr. Patel nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "That must have been very frightening for you. You think I'm making it up, don't you?" I snapped, the words hot and bitter on my tongue. But I'm not. I'm not crazy. Max, no one's saying you're making it up, he said, his tone frustratingly even. Sometimes under stress, our minds can create vivid experiences that feel completely real. It wasn't my mind, I growled. It was real. He was real. Why don't you check the security cameras? He must have been recorded coming and going. Dr. Patel paused, considering this for a moment. I'll look into it, he said finally. In the meantime, I'd like to adjust your medication. It might help with the... I don't need more pills, I shouted, standing abruptly. I need you to believe me. Dr. Patel stood as well, keeping his hands raised in a placating gesture. We're just trying to help you, Max. Why don't we take this one step at a time? But I could see it in his eyes, the quiet, patronizing pity of someone who'd already made up his mind. He didn't believe me. None of them did. After he left, I was alone again. The room felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty. My skin prickled with the memory of John's cold smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, just out of sight. I spent the rest of the day staring at the empty bed across from mine, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. But the lingering question haunted me, gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. If John wasn't real, then who was in my room last night? That night, the emptiness of the room grew unbearable. I lay in my bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to drown out the restless hum of my thoughts. I could still feel the phantom weight of the knife against my throat, the ghost of John's eerie grin lingering in the dark corners of the room. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the faint whistle of air through the vents, set my nerves on edge. They told me John didn't exist, but the memory of his voice, the cold calculation in his eyes, was too vivid to dismiss as some kind of delusion. It wasn't a hallucination. Couldn't be. I rolled over, my gaze falling to the empty bed across the room. For a moment, I imagined him sitting there, his thin frame hunched forward, his sharp features illuminated by the pale moonlight. The image was so clear that I almost called out to him, but the words died in my throat. The sound stopped me. It was faint at first, like the soft rustling of fabric. I froze, my breath caught in my chest, straining to listen. The noise came again, a whispering, scratchy and low, like voices muffled by thick walls. It wasn't coming from the hallway or another room. It was coming from inside the walls. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I whispered, the word trembling as it left my lips. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. I was about to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, when the bed across from me creaked, the kind of sound a mattress makes when someone sits on it. My stomach churned. The bed was empty. I could see it with my own eyes. But the sound came again, louder this time, the groaning of strained springs, as if invisible weight were shifting on the thin mattress. My breath quickened, and my skin crawled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I clenched my fists and forced myself to stand. My legs felt like jelly as I took a cautious step toward the empty bed. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaky but louder now. No answer. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, as though the light itself had been swallowed. The bed creaked again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Something moved. I didn't see it directly, just a flicker of motion in the corner of my eye. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting unnaturally across the wall. It slid toward the corner of the room, disappearing into the faint glow of the vent at floor level. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away, nearly tripping over my own bed. The whispers began again, louder this time, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. The words were garbled, incomprehensible, but the malice in them was unmistakable. "Stop!" I shouted, clamping my hands over my ears. The noise ceased. Silence returned, but it was different now, more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the shadows in the room were pressing in closer, watching, waiting. I stumbled back onto my bed, pulling the thin blanket over myself as though it could shield me from whatever was lurking in the dark. My eyes stayed locked on the empty bed across the room, its surface still and unbroken, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was in this room, something that wasn't supposed to be here, and it wasn't leaving. Sleep was a distant memory. I sat upright in bed, clutching the blanket like it was some kind of shield. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears until even the faintest creak of the building felt like a scream. My eyes darted to every corner, every shadow. The room seemed alive, shifting and watching with every blink. Then I heard it, laughter. It wasn't loud. It was soft, almost playful, a childlike giggle that bubbled up from nowhere and everywhere at once. It crawled under my skin, tightening my throat with its unnatural glee. The sound was so out of place, so wrong, that I could barely process it. Laughter wasn't supposed to sound like that, like it had been dragged through shards of glass and stitched back together. "Who's there?" My voice was hoarse, more of a croak than a demand. The giggling stopped, replaced by the low hum of the ventilation system. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that my mind was spiraling out of control. But then the laughter returned, closer this time, louder. It echoed from the walls, each chuckle bouncing and twisting into something darker. I jumped out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. My chest heaved as I spun in circles, trying to locate the source of the sound. "What do you want?" I shouted. The laughter stopped abruptly, as though it had been cut off with a blade. Silence engulfed the room once more, but it was short-lived. The bed across from mine groaned again. My heart seized as I turned to look. The mattress sagged in the middle, as though an unseen weight was pressing down on it. The whispering returned, layered and frantic, like 100 voices murmuring secrets just out of reach. "Stop it!" I screamed, clutching my head. The whispers turned into a roar, a cacophony of voices that rose and fell in a terrifying symphony. Words began to form, disjointed and senseless. "He's here. You shouldn't have looked. Run, Max, run!" I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as my eyes locked on the bed. The mattress was moving now, the sag deepening as though something was crawling across it. Something heavy and alive. The laughter returned, louder than before. It filled the room, bouncing off the walls until I could feel it vibrating in my bones. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The sound burrowed into my head, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse. It was suffocating, a thick, oppressive weight that made my skin crawl. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the cold wall, too terrified to move. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the others, began to rise from the bed. It wasn't a person, it couldn't have been. Its form was shifting and amorphous, like smoke trapped in a glass jar. But the eyes were unmistakable. They were John's, piercing, calculating, and filled with something far worse than madness. "Max," the shadow hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "Why did you let me in?" I didn't answer, couldn't. My throat was dry, my tongue useless. The shadow began to move toward me, slithering across the floor like oil. I scrambled backward, pressing myself tighter against the wall as it came closer, its dark tendrils reaching for me. The door to my room burst open, flooding the space with harsh fluorescent light. Nurses and an orderly rushed in, their expressions a mix of concern and alarm. "Mox, what's happening?" one of them asked, grabbing my arm. I pointed to the bed, my mouth moving but no words coming out. They followed my gaze, but the bed was empty. No sagging mattress, no shadows, no eyes. Just the same cold, sterile room. "It was here," I whispered, barely audible. "He was here." The nurse gave me a look of pity, the kind that made my stomach turn. "Max, there's nothing here." "You're safe." But I wasn't safe. Not from this. As they led me out of the room, I glanced back one last time. The shadows were still there, watching, waiting, and somewhere in the distance, I could still hear the laughter. The following day felt surreal, like I was navigating a dream from which I couldn't wake. The nurses kept glancing at me with the kind of pity reserved for patients who were teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Dr. Patel checked in again, his tone overly gentle, his words carefully chosen. It only made me feel worse. "We've reviewed the security footage from your wing," he said, sitting across from me in the dimly lit interview room. His clipboard rested on his lap, untouched. "There's nothing unusual, Max. No one entered or left your room last night." "That's impossible," I said, my voice breaking. "He was there. John was there." Dr. Patel sighed. "We also checked our records. There's no patient named John in this facility, nor has there been in the last 6 months." My stomach sank. "You're lying." "I assure you, Max, we're not." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I'm telling you, he was real. He was in my room. He had a knife. He was watching me." Dr. Patel's expression softened into that infuriating mask of concern. It's not uncommon for patients under stress to experience vivid hallucinations, especially if they've been struggling with sleep deprivation. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to do anything that would force him to believe me. But what would be the point? To them, I was just another delusional patient. After our session, I wandered the sterile halls aimlessly. I couldn't bring myself to go back to my room, not after what had happened. Instead, I found myself drifting toward the administrative wing. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Answers, validation, something to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The door to the records room was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stepped inside, my bare feet soundless on the cold tile floor. The room was small and cramped, its walls lined with shelves of manila folders and filing cabinets. A single computer sat on a desk in the corner, its monitor humming faintly. I knew this was forbidden, that I could get in serious trouble if I were caught. But I didn't care. I needed to know the truth. I sifted through the files labeled with patient names, searching for any mention of John. My hands trembled as I flipped through pages, the sterile scent of paper and ink filling my nostrils. Nothing. Not a single record. I moved to the computer, the outdated machine groaning as it powered up. The login screen blinked at me, asking for credentials I didn't have. Frustration boiled in my chest as I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, almost instinctively, I typed his name, John. The screen flickered. For a brief moment, it went black, and I thought I'd broken the damn thing. But then something appeared. A file, marked with a single word. Inactive. My breath hitched as I clicked on it. The document was sparse, its contents cryptic. Patient name, John Doe admittance date. Classified discharge date. Not applicable status. Transferred. Transferred? To where? The file offered no further details, just a vague note at the bottom. Case closed. Restricted access. I barely had time to process the information before the screen abruptly shut off, the room plunging into silence. Panic surged through me as I jabbed at the power button, but the computer remained lifeless. It was as if the file had erased itself. "Max," I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. An orderly stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of suspicion and concern. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded. I was just looking for..." My mind raced for an excuse, but the words wouldn't come. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said, stepping forward. "Come with me." I let him lead me out of the records room, my thoughts spinning wildly. The file might have been wiped, but I had seen it. I wasn't crazy. John had been here. But if that was true, then why had they gone to such lengths to erase him? And where had they sent him? The orderly escorted me back to my room, his grip firm but not rough. My protests fell on deaf ears. "You can discuss this with Dr. Patel," he said curtly. When he left, he locked the door behind him, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my fear. The file I'd seen on the computer was burned into my mind. Jomdu. Admitted. Transferred. Case closed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove I wasn't entirely insane. He had been here. The institution was hiding something they didn't want me or anyone else to uncover. I sat on my bed, staring at the empty one across from me. My mind raced with questions, but there was no one to answer them. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his hollow, unnerving smile and those predatory eyes. That night, sleep eluded me once again. I lay in bed, clutching the blanket tightly as though it could protect me from the encroaching darkness. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the vents, made me flinch. Then came the sound of footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, echoing faintly through the hall outside my door. My pulse quickened as the steps grew louder, closer. I strained my ears, holding my breath, trying to make out more. The lock on my door rattled, followed by a slow, ominous creak as the door eased open. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway light spilled into the room, stretching long shadows across the floor. A figure stood just beyond the threshold, half obscured by the shadows. "John!" My voice cracked. The figure didn't move, stood there, silent and still, watching me. My instincts screamed to run, to scream for help, but my body was frozen. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, as though the figure's very presence was warping reality. Then slowly it stepped forward. The shadows clung to it, writhing like living things, obscuring its face. But I knew it was him. I could feel his presence, oppressive and cold, radiating from the dark. "You shouldn't have looked, Max," the figure whispered, its voice distorted and unnatural. "You let me in." My stomach churned, and bile rose in my throat. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. "To finish what I started." The room seemed to close in around me, the walls bending and twisting. The shadows moved unnaturally, stretching and contorting as though alive. I scrambled off the bed, backing into the corner. "You're not real. You can't be real." The figure's grin widened, impossibly so, splitting its face in two. "Oh, Mox, I'm as real as you made me." Before I could respond, the lights in the room flickered violently, plunging everything into a strobe-like nightmare. The figure surged forward, faster than I could process. I screamed, throwing up my arms to shield myself, but there was no impact. When the lights stabilized, the figure was gone. The room was empty, as if nothing had happened, but the door was still ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. I stumbled to the door, peering out into the hall. It was empty, silent. My breath came in shallow gasps as I leaned against the frame, trying to steady myself. The laughter started again, faint and distant, echoing from somewhere deep within the building. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The next morning, I woke slumped against the wall near the door, my body stiff and aching. Sleep had been impossible after last night's encounter, and the cold floor was hardly forgiving. Sunlight filtered weakly through the barred window, doing little to chase away the lingering dread. During morning rounds, I told the nurse everything, or at least tried to. She listened with the same look I was starting to expect from everyone, a mix of disbelief and patronizing concern. When I told her about the shadowed figure in my room and the laughter echoing through the halls, she exchanged a glance with the orderly who had followed her in. "I think we need to move you to a more secure area," she said, her voice overly soothing. "Just for a while, to help you feel safe." Safe. The word made me laugh bitterly. Nothing about this place felt safe anymore. They moved me to the locked ward later that afternoon. It was deeper in the facility, the windows even smaller, the doors reinforced with thick steel. My new room was identical to the last, cold, sterile, and utterly devoid of anything personal. But the bed was bolted to the floor, and the door had an observation slot that could be opened from the outside. Dr. Patel came to see me shortly after I settled in. He sat in the lone chair in the room, clipboard balanced on his knee. "I know this transition is difficult," he began, his tone carefully neutral. "But we're doing this for your safety." "My safety?" I scoffed. "From what? Shadows? Ghosts?" He didn't answer, which only fueled my frustration. "I'm not crazy," I snapped. "You have to believe me. Something is happening here. Something real. Why won't you look into it?" "We did look into it," he said patiently. "There's no record of anyone named John being admitted to this facility. We've checked the logs, the cameras, the staff. There's no evidence to support what you're saying." "Because you're hiding it?" I shot back. "You're covering something up." I saw his file. I saw it with my own eyes. His expression flickered, just for a moment. But it was enough to tell me I'd hit a nerve. "What file?" he asked, his tone measured. "In the records room," I said. "It was on the computer. A file marked inactive." "Jomdu." It said he'd been transferred. Dr. Patel's brow furrowed. He glanced down at his clipboard, tapping his pen against it absently. "I don't know what you think you saw, but the record system doesn't have a file like that. And even if it did, you wouldn't have access to it." "I did see it," I insisted, leaning forward. "Why would I lie about this?" He didn't answer. Instead, he rose to his feet, tucking the clipboard under his arm. "Get some rest, Max. We'll talk again soon." And with that, he left, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. I sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of his words pressing down on me. They didn't believe me. They thought I was delusional. But I wasn't. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd felt. The room seemed to darken as the day wore on, the weak sunlight fading into a dull gray haze. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Was it possible I was imagining all of this? Could my mind really be playing tricks on me? No. The laughter, the shadows, the whispers, those were real. I was sure of it. As the night deepened, the silence of the ward became oppressive. The air felt heavier, colder. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around myself, trying to ward off the chill. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and pulse, just at the edges of my vision. And then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway. Slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside my door. The observation slot slid open, revealing a pair of eyes staring in. They weren't the kind, clinical eyes of a nurse or an orderly. They were wild, unblinking, filled with a dark, manic energy. "John," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The eyes blinked once, and then the slot slammed shut. The door handle rattled, as though someone was trying to force it open. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, pressing myself against the wall. The rattling stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers racing down my spine. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. I was alone again, but I knew he'd be back. The next morning felt like an eternity away. When the pale light of dawn finally crept through the narrow window, I was still huddled in the corner of the room, my body stiff from hours of tension. My mind was a fog of exhaustion and paranoia. The laughter, the eyes, the rattling door, they all felt too real to be dismissed as dreams. Yet when the nurse brought my breakfast, she said nothing about the commotion from the night before. No one mentioned hearing footsteps, laughter, or the sound of someone trying to break into my room. "Did anyone else hear something last night?" I asked her, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. The nurse looked at me with thinly veiled concern. "No, Max. It was quiet all night. Are you feeling okay?" I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how ridiculous her words sounded, but I bit my tongue. It wouldn't matter. They already thought I was losing it. I ate in silence, my appetite non-existent, and waited for the day's monotony to begin. Therapy, medication, meals. It all blurred together in a haze of frustration and dread. But my thoughts kept drifting back to last night, to the figure at the door, to those eyes. By the time night fell again, my nerves were frayed. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, my entire body tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. The first sound came just after lights out. A faint whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the vent. It was inside the room. "Max?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was low, familiar, and filled with malice. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. "Max?" It came again, closer this time. I clutched the blanket tightly, my knuckles white. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The shadows in the room grew darker, deeper, as though the very light was being consumed. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it didn't help. The laughter was inside my head now, echoing and overlapping until it was all I could hear. "You let me in," the voice whispered, its tone mocking and cruel. "You opened the door."
"No,"
I shouted, standing abruptly. "You're not real. You can't be real." The laughter stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed against the wall, my eyes darting wildly. Then, from the corner of the room, the shadows began to shift. Slowly, they coalesced into a shape, a figure, hunched and shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the gloom. "Why fight it, Max?" it hissed. "You belong to me now." I stumbled forward, grabbing the nearest object, a metal cup from my dinner tray, and hurled it at the figure. It passed through the shadow harmlessly, clattering to the floor. The figure laughed again, louder this time. "You can't escape me. I'm inside you, Max. I always have been."
"No,"
I screamed, clutching my head. "You're lying." But even as I denied it, I could feel the truth of its words. The darkness wasn't just in the room. It was in me, growing, spreading, consuming. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined. His face was familiar now, too familiar. It was my face, twisted and warped into something grotesque. "Don't you see?" it whispered, leaning closer. "You can't run from yourself." The door burst open, and the lights flickered on. Nurses and orderlies flooded into the room, their voices urgent and panicked. But the figure was gone, vanished as though it had never been there. I collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving with sobs. They lifted me onto the bed, strapping me down as I thrashed and screamed. But even as they restrained me, I could hear the voice, faint and mocking, whispering in the back of my mind, "You let me in." The restraints didn't leave much room for movement, but that hardly mattered. I was too exhausted, too hollowed out by the events of the night to fight back. The staff's reassurances were distant and hollow, like echoes in a cavern. They told me I was safe, that everything was going to be okay. But they were wrong. I knew better. The thing I had seen wasn't gone. It wasn't lurking in the shadows or waiting just outside the door anymore. It had taken up residence somewhere much closer, somewhere inescapable. Inside me, the sedative they injected dulled my body but sharpened my mind in strange ways. My thoughts came in rapid flashes, flickering between memories and fears, between John's hollow grin and that twisted, shadowy version of myself. I tried to hold on to reality, to tether myself to something concrete, but it was like trying to grip smoke. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but the dreams came quickly. The room in my dream was not my cell, though it was eerily similar. The walls stretched impossibly high, their surfaces black and glistening as though coated in oil. The bed was gone, replaced by a single chair in the center of the room, and on it sat John. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. The knife was gone from his hand, but his fingers twitched as though he were still holding it. "Why did you let me in, Max?" he asked, his voice echoing unnaturally. "I didn't," I said, though even I didn't believe it. John tilted his head, his lips curling into something that might have been a sneer. "You don't remember, do you? You opened the door. You asked me to come." "No," I whispered. "That's not true." But even as I denied it, flashes of memory surged to the surface. A dark hallway, a door ajar, my own hand reaching out to push it open, a face in the shadows, grinning, waiting. "You let me in," John repeated, standing now. His form began to shift, the edges of his body blurring and twisting. "And now you'll never be free." The shadows around him rose like a living thing, coiling and writhing until they consumed him completely. When they receded, he was gone, and in his place stood the figure from the night before, my twisted double. It smiled, and I felt the same smile tugging at my own lips, as though my face were no longer my own. "We're not so different, you and I," it said. Its voice was mine, but warped and distorted. "You created me, and now you'll become me." I woke screaming, thrashing against the restraints that pinned me to the bed. The room was bathed in pale morning light, but the brightness offered no comfort. I could feel it, the presence, the darkness. It wasn't just a dream. It was real. It was inside me. The nurse rushed in, her face pale with concern. She tried to calm me, to check my vitals, but I couldn't stop shaking. "Get it out," I begged her, tears streaming down my face. "Please, get it out of me." She didn't understand. None of them did. They thought I was crazy, delusional, hallucinating. But I wasn't. I knew the truth now. I had let the darkness in, and it wasn't leaving, not without a fight. The days that followed blurred together, a haze of sedatives, therapy sessions, and sleepless nights. The staff thought they were helping me, but every attempt at reassurance felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my sanity. They didn't understand what I was fighting. How could they? They didn't see the thing in the shadows, the reflection in the mirror that wasn't quite mine. And then, it happened again. It started as a whisper during group therapy. Dr. Patel was speaking, his measured tone droning on about coping mechanisms, but I wasn't listening. My attention was elsewhere, on the faint, familiar voice threading through the air like smoke. "Max?" I stiffened, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. The voice was coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows pooled unnaturally, as if avoiding the fluorescent lights. "Max, why do you fight me?" the voice whispered. It was mine, but warped, twisted into something monstrous. "Mox." Dr. Patel's voice cut through the haze, drawing my attention back to the circle. He was staring at me, concern etched into his features. "Are you with us?" I nodded quickly, forcing myself to focus. "Yes." "Sorry." The session continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift whenever I glanced away, their edges rippling like water. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to bolt from the room. When the session ended, I stayed behind, lingering by the door as the others filed out. Dr. Patel approached, his brow furrowed. "You seemed distracted today," he said. "Is something bothering you?" For a moment I hesitated. Then the words spilled out in a desperate rush. "It's here, the thing inside me. It's watching me, waiting for me to give in." Dr. Patel's face softened into that infuriating mask of pity. "Max, I know you believe that, but it's not just in my head," I snapped, my voice rising. "I can feel it. I can hear it. It's real." He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch meant to be calming but only igniting my frustration. Sometimes our minds create these things as a way to process trauma. We can work through this, Max, together. I pulled away, shaking my head. "You don't understand. It's not a hallucination. It's real, and it's trying to take over. Dr. Patel sighed, his expression heavy with doubt. I'll increase your medication, but you need to trust us. Max, we're here to help you. I said nothing. My teeth clenched as I stormed out of the room. They couldn't help me. No one could. This was my fight, and I was losing. That night, the darkness returned with a vengeance. I sat on the edge of my bed, every muscle in my body tense as the room filled with an unnatural stillness. The air grew heavy, cold, and the faint hum of the ventilation system faded into silence. Max, the voice whispered, crawling into my ears like venom. I turned toward the corner of the room, where the shadows writhed and coalesced into a familiar form. My doppelganger stepped forward, its twisted smile gleaming in the dim light. You can't run from me, it said, its voice dripping with malice. You've already lost. No, I muttered, shaking my head. I won't let you take me. It laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the small room. You don't have a choice. I'm inside you, Max. I'm already a part of you. Get out of my head, I shouted, clutching my temples. My vision blurred as the laughter grew louder, deafening. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching toward me like hungry hands. And then something snapped. I surged forward, my fist swinging through the air. It connected with nothing, the shadows dissipating like smoke, but I didn't stop. I fought against the encroaching darkness, punching, clawing, screaming. My mind was a battlefield, and I was determined not to lose. You're weak, the voice hissed. You can't win. Watch me. I snarled, my voice filled with defiance. The struggle felt endless, the shadows relentless in their assault. But I refused to give up. Somewhere deep inside me, a spark of determination flared to life, burning brighter with every blow I struck. And then, as suddenly as it began, the darkness retreated. The room was silent once more, the shadows shrinking back into their corners. I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion. For the first time in days, the voice was silent. But I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The silence lingered into the next day, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the silence of a predator lying in wait. I could feel it, the darkness coiled deep within me, biding its time. The shadows in my room seemed calmer, less aggressive, but they didn't feel gone, just dormant. I spent most of the day in isolation. The nurses checked on me, their concern palpable, but I kept my answers short. I didn't need their pity, their platitudes. They couldn't help me with what was coming. By nightfall, I was ready. I had no plan, no strategy, only the unshakable resolve that I wouldn't let this thing win. Whatever it took, however far I had to go, I was prepared. As the lights dimmed and the ward settled into its eerie nighttime quiet, the air began to shift. The temperature dropped, and the walls seemed to press closer. I sat on my bed, my fists clenched, waiting for the inevitable. It didn't take long. Max! The voice slithered through the darkness like a serpent, soft and insidious. I looked toward the corner of the room, where the shadows thickened and pulsed. The familiar figure emerged, its form even more grotesque than before. It grinned at me, its twisted reflection of my own face brimming with malice. You've been fighting so hard, it said mockingly, but we both know how this ends. Not this time, I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. I'm not afraid of you anymore. The figure tilted its head, amused. Oh, Max, you don't understand, do you? I'm not something you can fight. I'm you. Every fear, every regret, every dark thought you've ever had. You can't destroy me without destroying yourself. Maybe I don't need to destroy you, I said, standing. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to stay upright. Maybe I just need to face you. The figure's smile faltered, just for a moment. The shadows around it writhed, their movements agitated. You think you're strong enough? After everything I've done to you? I know I am. The The figure lunged, faster than I could react. It slammed into me, its form cold and suffocating, and suddenly we were no longer in the room. The walls, the bed, the light, all of it dissolved, replaced by a vast, empty darkness. We stood alone in the void, face to face. Its grin was gone, replaced by a snarl of pure hatred. You think you can stand against me here? This is my domain. No, I said, my voice unwavering. It's ours. I stepped forward, meeting its gaze head-on. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, but I pushed the fear aside. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it on the figure's chest. The void shuddered. The figure recoiled, its form flickering. "What are you doing?" it demanded, its voice laced with panic. "I'm taking it back," I said, my hand pressing harder. "You don't control me. You never did." Light began to seep into the void, faint and golden, pushing back the darkness. The figure thrashed, its shape breaking apart, but I held firm. The fear, the doubt, the pain, it all surged through me, but I didn't let it stop me. "You're a part of me," I said, "but you don't own me. I own you." With a final burst of light, the figure disintegrated, its screams echoing into nothingness. The void collapsed, and suddenly I was back in my room, gasping for air. The shadows were gone, the oppressive weight lifted. The room felt normal. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly alone, and it was glorious. The following day, Dr. Patel seemed surprised by my transformation. "You look better," he said cautiously. "How are you feeling?" I met his gaze, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I feel free." He didn't understand, of course. None of them did. But that didn't matter. The darkness might still be a part of me, but it no longer controlled me. I had won. For now. Thank you for listening to my story. Like it if you liked it, and write in the comments if it was creepy or not.